Olá, boa tarde. Bom ver a todos novamente. Para a gente falar de psique americana, tem que falar de Frank Sinatra um pouco, né? Senão não ficaria coerente com a proposta. Né, Ipek? Imagino. Hoje a gente vai receber uma convidada bastante interessante. Queria apresentar para vocês Ipek Burnett. Vou fazer a apresentação formal primeiro da Ipek. Ipek é uma autora turca-americana, ela nasceu na Turquia, e ela oferece uma crítica psicológica profunda de questões sociais, culturais e políticas. Ipek veio para os Estados Unidos para se formar na Brown University em Cultura e Mídia Moderna e Relações Internacionais. Também recebeu seu mestrado em aconselhamento em psicologia no Instituto de Estudos Integrais da Califórnia e obteve um segundo mestrado e doutorado em psicologia profunda na Pacifica Graduate. Ela mora em São Francisco, trabalha com organizações de direitos humanos e escreve romances em turco na sua língua nativa. E ela é autora desse fabuloso livro, uma investigação junguiana da psique americana. Recomendo a todos esse livro, um livro fantástico, extremamente atual, contemporâneo, e a minha hipótese é de que esse livro nos ajuda muito a compreender os fenômenos recentes da psique americana, mas também, de algum modo, e eu acho que isso vai ser uma espécie de debate posterior, nos ajuda a entender algo também sobre o Brasil e alguma coisa de uma suposta alma brasileira. Ipek, prazer enorme te receber. Temos um grande amigo em comum, Gustavo Beck, que falou que vai aparecer aqui a qualquer momento. Sinta-se à vontade, uma grande alegria te receber. Tá? Obrigado pela tua presença.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation today. I, of course, wish we could be in person together, sitting around in a circle, face to face, without masks, without COVID, in Brazil or perhaps in San Francisco. And I hope that one day that can happen. I will look forward to that. I'm going to jump in right away because we're going to be talking about some really big, complex matters today, the American psyche, as well as collective traumas, collective defenses, collective fears and fantasies. It's kind of ambitious trying to cover all that ground, but I'm very excited. So I'll just dive in. The topic of today, American innocence as an addiction. I want to start by sharing a quote by archetypal psychologist, dear James Hillman. This quote is about innocence in America, and James Hillman says, "The innocence, and we love it. We want to stay pristine, untouched, ever new, forward-looking, bright, unwounded. As the country crumbles, they say, the best of America is in front of us. We want to stay innocent because if we woke up, we would see murdered bodies from here back to the first colonists. Buffalo, bison, forests, Indians, Negroes dead. So we stay innocent. Innocent is the American form of historical repression. Innocent is the American form of historical repression, Hillman says. So innocence as repression, innocence as escape, innocence as a shield from responsibility, from sin and shame and guilt, as well as self-awareness, self-knowledge. As we all know thyself is an ancient saying. It's really a spiritual, psychological, existential necessity. It's also the force, the drive behind psychology all along. For Sigmund Freud, knowing oneself meant recalling repressed personal memories. And Jung, of course, took that teaching beyond the personal consciousness and the personal unconscious with his concept of the collective unconscious, which is really a social historical reality then. So in Jungian approach to self-knowledge, while seeking what lies beyond the ego consciousness, one gets to confront the darkness within one's own psyche, as well as the dark side of the whole ancestral heritage. So the shadow and the collective shadow. And in the words of Jungian analyst Eric Newman, this kind of confrontation with the shadow causes a basic shift of the psychological center of gravity in a downward direction. And this deepening requires one to lose innocence and unambiguous certitude. That way we get to understand, recognize what exists outside of the rigid, simplistic ways of self-identification with positive values. So Eric Newman says the self-experience involved in the journey of depth psychology makes men poorer in illusions, but richer in insight and understanding. Poorer in illusions, but richer in insight and understanding. And to me, that really speaks to humility and wisdom. So knowing oneself is not about pride. It's not about this inflated sense of self-importance. It's really about taking an honest look at oneself, both the accomplishments and failures, acknowledging one's skills, strengths, inspirations, as well as the limitations, as well as the losses and failures and mistakes, the gaps in knowledge. And I firmly believe that, and this is very central to my work with depth psychology, cultural depth psychology, this imperative of know thyself applies to the collective as much as it applies to individuals. And when I say collective, I mean nations, tribes, religions, everything. So in nationalism, patriotic accounts select certain moments in time, certain triumphs, and tell these heroic self-narratives, which restore and retain visions of ourselves as just and proud and powerful. Yet for every history that is told, there are so many that are silenced. There is a dominant narrative, and then there are multitudes of counter-narratives. Those narratives live in the margins, and they often contradict, complicate the dominant narrative. In the case of the United States, we could be talking about the counter-narratives of Black Americans, the descendants of slaves, or Native Americans counter-narratives, those whose land has been stolen from them. But to go back to the dominant narrative in the United States, it's quite idealistic. This nation is built on such noble ideals. And since the beginning, it's been seen as a paradise, as a promised land, a new world for new beginnings. The Declaration of Independence speaks beautifully about the self-evident truths of equality, rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then there's the dream, the American dream of success and prosperity, upward social mobility. And it does not just end there within the nation, but there's this idea, almost a divine mission, to bring freedom and democracy to the world, especially those parts that the United States sees as being under oppressive regimes. But then we look at what lies in the shadow of these heroic, idealistic self-narratives, and we see land theft and genocide and slavery. We see xenophobia, racism, sexism. We see mass incarceration, immigrant detention centers. Around the world, we see the United States engage in endless war, nuclear bombs, drone strikes, and torture chambers. In the society itself, we see addictions of all sorts, from alcohol to painkillers, widespread depression, anxiety, reckless materialism, culture, corporate corruption, environmental destruction, also gun violence, mass shootings. How is this possible, right? There is such a stark difference, vast gap between the ideal, stated ideal, and the lived reality, because these contradictions are not in theory, they are the very lived daily experiences of many, many Americans. So to go back to James Hillman, toward the end of his life, James Hillman was very concerned about the American soul. And as he observed and talked about the fact that despite decay on all sides, economic, political, and more, United States was still in a stage of denial. It did not want to question or analyze its notions of power, freedom, progress. It did not want to question its self-image, or its inherent goodness and innocence, always looking to the future, always keeping an eye on the highest peak. It just went on believing in its exceptionalism. And from Hillman's psychological point of view, and here I'm quoting, living on illusions or delusions, and the reestablishing of these illusions or delusions requires a big effort to keep them from being seen through. But then something sudden happens, something violent happens, and there's this so-called loss of innocence. This happened many times in the history of the United States. Tragic events that tested the utopic visions and tempted the fall from innocence. The Civil War, Vietnam War, Watergate scandal, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., mass shootings, as in the one in Columbine High School shooting, where 10, 12-year-old kids went in with their guns and killed their classmates. There's this shock. September 11, of course, the terrorist attacks and Abu Ghraib tortures. Once something like this comes and shakes people up, there is almost a waking up from the slumber. And we hear it everywhere in the media, on the streets, this loss of innocence. America lost its innocence. But how many times can America lose its innocence? Can innocence be lost and then regained again and again? This is a very troubling, perpetual pattern. And moreover, in the face of all the despair and violence the history presents, how can we even talk about maintaining innocence? Jung once said, every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol or pain, or morphine or idealism. And for James Hillman, United States, this American obsession with innocence was an addiction, in fact. And he said, the addiction to innocence, to not knowing life's darkness and not wanting to know either, I think that's a very important part, not wanting to know either, constitutes America's endemic national disease. And again, Hillman saw it. America's hubris about its virtue gives way to this relentless resistance to engaging in critical consciousness. And in the end, while America may see itself as good and innocent, other nations often perceive its intents and actions as righteous and even violent. I'm going to share a few brief examples. These are very pointed examples. President Franklin Roosevelt explained the American government's intention during World War II as, and this is an exact quote, to cleanse the world of ancient evils, ancient ills, and to make very certain that the world will never suffer again. Then the US military dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. During Vietnam War, an American officer told an AP reporter it became necessary to destroy the town in order to save it. And after September 11 terrorist attacks, the US government called its occupation of Iraq a path to liberation. It was to liberate the Iraqi people. So throughout history, American ideals of democracy and freedom, the so-called good intentions, and beliefs in its own innocence, end up justifying violence, conquests, tyranny, imperial ambitions. So here lies the paradox that I'm really interested in. There seems to be something violent in America's innocence, the way it attempts to bury the ugly truths, the way it escapes the uncomfortable, the difficult, the responsibility, really, the acknowledgement, self-reflection. American novelist and civil rights activist, one of my favorite American authors, James Baldwin, says, "It is the innocence which constitutes the crime in America." So the addiction to innocence, to not knowing and to not wanting to know either, enables and furthers instances of repression as well as violence. In a way, the way I see it, innocence and violence in this case are not opposites. They feed off one another. They're interrelated. They are more of a couple, a pair. They're two halves, two poles of the same constellation. And one metaphor I like to use is a coin. They're like two sides of a coin. And like a coin, they signify power. They have a currency, a transaction. And we have to pay attention to their dialectic, the dialectic between innocence and violence, and how it plays out in American politics and American history. So just 2 months ago in January, as you also might know, pro-Trump supporters launched a violent attack and stormed the Capitol Hill building in DC to interrupt the confirmation of the new American president, Joe Biden. After the insurgency, Joe Biden made a public statement and said, "The scenes at the Capitol Hill do not reflect true America, do not represent who we are." And here's my disclaimer. I voted for Joe Biden, and I am so relieved to have him as my new president. However, here I strongly disagree with him. The people who stormed the Capitol Hill building, they were carrying Confederate flags. Those flags, very American. They're the history of America. They were white nationalists. That is very American. They were fueled by conspiracy theories about a stolen election. And they had this entitlement, righteousness. So many of them, when they got arrested later on and were interviewed by FBI, They were surprised. They did not see what they did to be a crime. The fact that they scaled the walls, broke through windows, ransacked the offices of members of the Congress, threatened their lives, but they didn't think this to be a crime because in their mind, they were taking back their country. So there's this righteousness, there's this willful ignorance, almost an arrogance about this ignorance, moral indifference, and blind patriotism, really, for me, what it boils down to those. And most of all, the whole insurrection was supported and cited by the American president at the time, Donald Trump. So when Biden says these themes reflect true America, he's creating a dichotomy, a false America, as if there's a true America and a false America. That's not the case. It's all America. No. Black Lives Matter protests, they are America. White nationalists, they're America. Silicon Valley billionaires, that's America, as well as the Native Americans who live in reservations under extreme poverty, that's also America. So the rural and urban, Democrat, Republican, left, right, rich, poor, there's no such thing as false America. I think it's really crucial to accept this complexity. There's no simplifying this. And complexity, diversity, inner contradictions are not the threat to the so-called United States of America. The real threat is the denial of this complexity, denial of the fractures, denial of the inherent tensions and contradictions. That is the real danger, trying to simplify America. And speaking of course, the true-false dichotomies, something we hear a lot these days in the United States, and perhaps you can relate to this, is facts, right? There are facts and then alternative facts, news and then fake news. But my question is, what about fantasies? What role do fantasies play in all this? Because America is a nation built on fantasies. Paradise, promised land, the new world, city upon a hill, the frontier, the American dream. These are not facts. None of them. They are images and myths on which American consciousness depend. And fantasies, we can't really dismiss them as being fantasies because fantasies are not passive. They're not merely internal. They're not passive. These fantasies actively form and reinforce our perception of historical, political, social realities, and they define our experience of ourselves as a nation and the world in which we live. And fantasies beget fantasies. They they turn into ideologies. They even write policies, public and foreign policies. So fantasies are political. Fantasies are social. They're not confined to the inner mind, the isolated individual imagination. They're out there in the world, enacted on every day. And we see them, we hear them in political speeches, Hollywood movies, TV ads. We are so used to these fantasies, we take them for granted, as if they're factual, which they are not. American Dream is a good example of this, because American Dream is not a fact. It has a psychological truth, a yearning, but it's not a fact. What does the American Dream promise? American Dream says that if you work hard enough, you can lift yourself up by your bootstraps and become successful, become rich, move up in society. The person who takes the American Dream for granted and takes it like a fact looks at another who lives in poverty and says, oh, that person is poor because they're not working hard enough, because they're lazy, because they like government handouts. So this fantasy of American dream then makes them overlook some very complex historical, systematic realities, structural realities, systematic racism, economic obstacles in the way of that person who was born into poverty. Another example I could give is the New World. You know, this New World is not a fact. When the settlers, colonists arrived here on the American continent, there were already native tribes, indigenous people living here. There were animals and trees. There was nothing new about this land. The newness is the fantasy which represses the memories of genocide and destruction and colonization. And the feelings, of course, that go with them, you know, the sin and the guilt and the horror and the grief. So the matter is that we need to become conscious of the fantasies. They are everywhere. We just need to recognize them for what they are. And one more example I want to share with you is from the United States, the founding of the Republic, the Declaration of Independence, which is such an important document. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence famously said, "We hold truth to be self-evident. All men are created equal. They have certain unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." However, in 1776, the self-evident truth was inequality. The 56 delegates who signed the declaration were all men. They were all white. They were all wealthy. And most of them were slaveholders. They did not intend their words to apply to their slaves. They did not intend those words to apply to Native Americans or the poor people or women. So the language of the Declaration of Independence was eloquent, but the reality was entirely different. You know, the new nation suffered from deep divisions, social, economic, ethnic, racial, and great injustices. The Declaration of Independence in the United States is seen as a founding document, you know, affirming the American ideals. But when we look at it closely, we also see that it is a strong evidence of the gap between those ideals and reality. So the way I see it is Declaration of Independence is in fact a declaration of America's United States' self-deception. So part of the world here is to imagine, understand, and own the realities overshadowed by the rhetoric of pride and power. We have to consider the dissonance between political promises and social realities. In a way, this seeing through is like deconstructing the dominant narratives, deliteralizing history. Hillman would say it's like looking at the daylight world from the night side, or Pat Berry would say bringing an underworld perspective to upper world realities. Because that psychology always invites us to seek the shadows that are cast by the light. You know, lend an ear to the symptoms, notice the unspokens, hold multiple perspectives, accept ambiguity and uncertainty, learn from them, right? To be curious about complexity and contradictions. what happens when we take myth literally? What happens when we look at a fantasy and think of it as a fact is just the opposite: fundamentalism, narrow-mindedness, either-or thinking, black and white thinking, a one-dimensional view of the world, very simplistic. So innocence, in that sense, proclaims noble ideals and intentions, such as civilizing and spreading democracy. It reads the world in terms of good and evil, right and wrong. It stands always aligned with the good and the right. It deplores that which does not fit in its simplistic, optimistic, prosperous vision. And all this adds up to a sense of entitlement and justification. So what happens when the country is so forward-looking, so future-oriented? The past gets repressed. When it's obsessed with success, failures, mistakes, losses get repressed. When it's always in a pursuit of happiness, grief gets repressed. And we saw this here during the COVID-19 crisis, which of course we still are in. There has been this such strong resistance to the reality of COVID-19 and the deaths. More than 500,000 died in the United States. Last time I looked, it was 550,000 people died due to COVID-19. For a nation that believes itself to be exceptional, a superpower, a world leader, optimistic, always looking to the future, to suddenly be so vulnerable by a virus that is invisible to the naked eye. It's shocking. It's very challenging. It should be very humbling too. But there is a lot of resistance to it, in the government in particular. And now we're getting a little better. There we have some vaccinations at least, but still, there's still a lot of resistance. But we know that the repressed, the grief, the past, the pain, they don't go away. We can't even talk about the return of the repressed, because the repressed is always there. It's always just around the corner, lurking in the shadows, under the surface. It's always present, really. And we can see this in the everyday instances of violence, depression, oppression, except, of course, in the dominant patriotic narratives. So going back to innocence, and the very first quote I offered from Hillman, the innocence, and we love it. We want to stay pristine, untouched, ever new, forward-looking, bright, unwounded. Unwounded, that's what Hillman says. In closing, I want to summon the contrary, the image of the wound. And before I go into the image, I want to say a few words why I'm summoning up such an image. First of all, the wound is both about harm and hurt, but also healing. It's about vulnerability and violence. And for me, it's also an image that speaks to the heart. It touches the heart. It opens up the heart to some compassion. And it has the power to arouse some psychological resonance and awaken moral imagination that Hillman says no syndrome can be truly dislodged from its cursed condition unless we first move imagination into its heart. And I guess this is my attempt to move some imagination into the heart of this cursed condition, this addiction to innocence. Because it's much easier, in my opinion, to be critical and cynical and dry and quantitative, empirical. But what will bring change, really, in my opinion, is It's going to come with empathy and imagination, because with empathy and imagination, only then we can build solidarity. And I do this work, I write about this, and I speak about this, not from a critical place only, but also out of love. You know, I'm an immigrant. I chose to live here in the United States. I chose to become an American citizen. I chose to raise my family, have my kids in this country because I love this country. And I know it can do so much better. There's a lot of creativity and inspiration and innovation and resilience, so much resilience in this culture. But it really needs to reckon with its past and its pain. So the image of the wound, for me, brings up that empathy that I need to connect on a deep level. So innocence suddenly is not just something to get rid of. It's not just a curse, but something to be tended to when I think of it as a wound. Innocence as a wound, then, in the American psyche, it's a historical inheritance and ancestral inheritance, a suffering. And I want to end by reading a very short section from the very end of my book, from the conclusion about the wound. With empathy and compassion, we can attempt to reimagine the centuries-old innocence that rules the American psyche. Obstinate, but not absolute. Not immaculate, but worn out, stained, sore, and innocence that suffers. And an innocence that is itself a form of suffering. An innocence that is a wound. Rather than trying to lose or restore the wound, we can simply feel into its throbbing pain. And we can receive it as an immanent image of both hurt and healing. It is here in the wound that we get to meet the miracle of American history in its entire complexity. For the wound is the ancestral inheritance. Yet it need not bleed and fester evermore. Once examined by critical thinking and moral imagination, and treated with the salve of empathic understanding, the wound will begin to heal gradually, from its deep core to its edges, until a scab of self-awareness forms on its surface. And in the end, when that scab falls off, a faded scar will always remain in the collective consciousness as an embodied reminder of both America's vulnerability and violence. I just want to end this part of our conversation with that image of the wound and also the scar. The scar is a reminder.
Obrigado, Ipek.
And thank you. And I did mention to Marcus, but I also want to say to everyone, I shared some quotes in that talk. If any of you are interested in the citations, just get in touch with me through Marcus. I'd be more than happy to share that information with you.
Obrigado, Ipek. Várias questões para a gente poder discutir. Acho que você traz algumas questões que também, de alguma maneira, repercutem na realidade brasileira. Vamos tentar montar uma conversa. Para quem quiser fazer a pergunta, bota o nome no chat e eu chamo, tá? Seguindo o modelo do Tiaços anterior. Ipek, queria duas questões para você. Você trouxe uma expressão que é muito interessante. Você falou que parece que há um fracasso do luto da inocência, da perda da inocência. Quer dizer, quantas vezes os americanos terão que perder a inocência até que eles possam se conscientizar disso? uma primeira pergunta seria pensar, será que um dos efeitos desse fracasso, do luto, da perda da inocência, é a própria violência americana? Quer dizer, a violência americana ela é fruto de uma incapacidade da perda da inocência? Essa é uma primeira questão que eu queria colocar para você. Um segundo ponto, vou fazer as duas juntos, tá? Um segundo ponto, dentro da literatura junguiana tradicional, a psique americana é pensada, me parece, num triângulo, que seria violência, e aí muito uma cultura das armas. Um outro polo seria a dimensão puer, de uma perpétua adolescência, uma adolescência prolongada, perpétua. E esse terceiro que você está me trazendo, que é o vício da inocência. Você acha que esse é, de alguma maneira, o campo arquetípico da psique americana? Violência, o aspecto puer e a inocência. Os três se amarram. Queria te ouvir um pouco sobre.
Thank you, Marcus, for those questions. Absolutely. And I feel that the way you ask those questions, I just say, I want to respond by saying yes, because you've verbalized them so nicely. The first question, yes, I think part of the intrinsic violence is definitely this failure, this resistance, that fear of losing the innocence. And the innocence is perhaps the very first American myth, in the way I see it at least, coming to the New World, from Europe. Those who came, they were trying to start a new life. They were escaping the oppression in Europe. And they were very religious too, and they believed that this was just going to be a new beginning for them. And they literalized the myth, but they really thought they were coming to paradise, because they took the myth literally. And when they arrived, it turns out it wasn't paradise. They were faced with a lot of difficulties while they were fighting with the native people, indigenous people. They were, the nature, weather was very different than they're used to. Sickness, they just were having a very hard transition. It wasn't the romanticized idea at all. And I just keep wondering, how did they do it? And what kept them going is this stubborn belief in, no matter what, this is paradise. And whatever they did, the genocides, the destruction, they all did it in the name of that myth of innocence and new start. And it's so deeply embedded somehow in the American psyche. They say the Puritan inheritance in the American psyche. If their stories, their struggles are inherent in the American psyche, then it's their yearning for this innocence. So violence and not wanting to let go of that innocence is very much intrinsic. And like you were saying, with the intrinsic violence, an example would be, actually, this is probably easier to relate to, September 11 terrorist attacks. When that happened, there was suddenly this loss of innocence in the United States, they said. But the move, rather than staying with the loss, the grief, the mourning, immediately there was a war against terror. And it's very interesting to think of that terminology, terror, because what is terror? Terror means fear. So a war was declared against fear. We went from vulnerable, really vulnerable, to a place of anger and legitimized terror. There was an opportunity there to really warm the innocence, the image, self-image of this untouchable, invulnerable superpower. But that opportunity was not taken. And for those who did speak about that, many esteemed cultural critics and philosophers, when they talked about this is an opportunity for the United States to look at itself and see how its actions are affecting the rest of the world, how we're interdependent, when that was offered, that was seen as being un-American. They said this is not the time to criticize the United States. And I have a hard time with that, because I think that criticism, that yearning for self-reflection comes from a place of actually love. And the way I see it, to say America, to resist that is almost un-American. Because if you think the United States is so strong and so good, then why are you afraid of a little self-reflection? That resistance to me says something about the fragility of that narrative. True love is really about seeing the other as who they are. So I wonder if those people who don't want to criticize and hold on to innocence do so not out of their true love for the country, but out of a fear. It comes from a place of fear. When we look at someone we love, we see them with all their imperfections, see them as human. And that's not despite of those imperfections, but with all of it, we love them. That's what real love to me is. Same with a country. I mean, I love this country, like I said. I love it, and I see all this other sides of it. Otherwise, we're loving a fantasy. We're upholding a projection that is not real. So I took your question and ran with it in a few different directions there, Marcus. But your second question was about this triangle, right? The violence, eternal innocence, and the addiction. And the way I see it, yes, that's like the Bermuda Triangle, right? It's a dangerous zone. It's a dangerous zone when those things come together and activate each other. And I cannot tell you, I know you didn't ask, but I know I should say this. I cannot tell you how the United States breaks out of that. And I like to usually mention this because that's not what I try. I'm not after a theory, an answer, a conclusion, a dead end. My work, as I see it, is about raising these questions, complicating, in the spirit of James Hillman, who always also loved to complicate and raise questions and irritate at times. So that is also my goal and inspiration, really. I live in a culture in the United States. It's loves, the self-help, self-improvement, 10 steps to happiness, quick solutions, fast food. I don't believe in any of that. And what's needed really is critical reflection, critical thinking, and there's no easy way to do that except for wrestling, really wrestling with the ideas. Yeah. Thank you, Marcus. Those were excellent questions.
Obrigado, Ipek. Gustavo Beck, my dear friend Mexican. Gustavo.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah. How are you? Good to see you.
Very good to see you, Gustavo. Been many years.
I know. I was thinking, because I really resonate with this issue, and I was wondering, there's three related questions in a way. One is, I was just talking to a group of friends of mine from the US about how irritating it is for me, how they feel that now that Biden has been elected, something has changed. As if, and I'm curious about the sequence of Obama, Trump, and Biden, and how suddenly, like, oh, you know, there's an implicit return to this sort of theme of greatness, which seems in itself really innocent. And what I was telling them was that how the way it feels from the outside is that it was easier to relate to the Americans when you had Trump as president than now that they have Biden as president. Because when they had Trump as president, they're like, oh, you know, you're like the rest of the world. You have a shitty president, and you have issues, and you don't like him, and there's problems and such and such. So that's one thing. Like this difficulty of having a faulty father, so to speak, or a limited father. And the other, that for me is related to this notion of being American in terms of, I think this they share with Jungians, a way of using the pronoun we when they say we Americans or we Jung, which is for me very excluding of everybody else. So I don't know exactly what I'm asking, but for me, it's particularly the difficulty to relate to otherness that I'm interested in, and how that's related to innocence.
Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you. And I'll start with Biden. As I said, I voted for him, but I do not share your friend's, I guess, optimism or innocence. I do not believe that now that we have Biden, America is great again. And no, as much as I don't want to keep thinking and talking about Trump, I will, because I have to, right? It's not about Trump, it's bigger than Trump. And who knows, he might be the president in 4 years again, because he still has that support behind him. So we have to take it very seriously. I really liked what you said, honestly, about when Trump was president, there was more you could resonate with, relate to United States better. It's true because, you know, the history that legitimized Trump and put him to where he is, again, that is so much America. And his Trump's brand, political brand, was always this stubborn resentment and his embrace of an arrogant embrace of ignorance, disdain for others, and violent rhetoric, right? And this made for great ratings in the media and for very divisive, disastrous presidency. But what is really interesting about Trump, I like to think, he's not the problem itself, he's a symptom, of course. The way he personified so many traits of the American shadow, the collective shadow, his unapologetic selfishness, self-centeredness, his disregard for others, which was implicit in your second question, the we, you know, his disdain for others and other people's perspectives, his inability to make peace or accept any failure, any vulnerability, any weakness, loss, of course. His rejection of all responsibility, not taking any responsibility, obsession with material gains and success, his reactionary way of being, all those explosive tweets, his inability to sit still and reflect. All these, I feel like Trump embodied all these traits of the collective American shadow, which nothing is specific to Trump. And none of this is new. The blind patriotism, it's not new. They were always here, this racism, violent rhetoric. It was always here in the United States, even in the government. It was just not as obvious. What Trump did very beautifully and successfully is to bring all that and put it in the middle of the stage, turn all the lights on for everyone to see, the whole world to see the American shadow. And then, you know, now he's gone, at least temporarily. That box he opened, it's still there. Oh, Biden cannot suddenly close it up and tuck it into the storage. That's not an option. It's not possible. So what needs to be done right now is to get to work with all those components. And, you know, Biden's work with immigration, I have some hopes, and racial justice, I have some hopes. But it's not something this administration is going to solve. You know, it's absolutely not. It would be very innocent to, I mean, I can't sit back and relax since the election. I can't. There's so much work to be done that's beyond our lifetimes too. And yeah, what you said.
And I think that's what I was aiming at, that the difficult work for him is integrating that shadow, not repressing it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It is, because it's, you know, in psychology, that's the work, right? We identify the shadow traits, own them, and integrate them. And part of his work is to really help, I think, the collective own them, which he's going to be, you know, met with a lot of resistance from a lot of people. But there will be also those who are, after the last 4 years, willing to hear that. But the integration, the reconciliation, that is really long haul. And I do not think that at any point in time, the whole country is gonna come together in this beautiful union. And I mean, now, currently the United States is more polarized than it has ever been. The left and the right, it's so polarized. And I wish I was as optimistic as your friends, Gustavo. I'm not. There is such lack of dialogue between the two sides. Everybody is in their echo chambers. There's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah,
And
I think they're older. I think that's why they're optimistic. They're much older, so they can be naive again.
yeah, I wonder if it's a generational thing. I'm not really sure. But I think also part of me is I am having these perspectives because I'm also an immigrant. You know, I wasn't born into this narrative of American greatness and innocence. I came here, I became an adult here. I spent my whole adult life here, but it's still not in me as much, perhaps, as for them. Like that can get triggered for them easier. I'm more on the margins. I don't feel that I'm an outsider since I've been here for over 20 years. I don't see myself as an outsider, but I have a certain distance, which I like. That gives me a healthy perspective, which is what I'm hoping. That's also what we, in psychology, therapists and analysts, we also try to maintain that perspective, that observation, that to be able to witness what's happening. So yeah. Oh, your other question, Gustavo, we. Isn't that the use of we? I struggled with that so much when I was writing, actually, because I did not even want to say American initially, but all my references, because America, it's a continent. It's not just the United States, but when you say America about United States, you're making this assumption that it's all that country, it's all the United States. It was very hard. All my references refer to everything as American, American people, American ideology, American redemption. So I had to write a nice long endnote about that in my book, but it's something, yeah, very problematic indeed.
Thanks.
Obrigado, Gustavo. Good to see you, my friend. Martinha.
Oi? Oi, tá me ouvindo? Primeiro, obrigado, Ipek, porque tá muito boa realmente a palestra, acho que é muito importante, inclusive para a gente aqui do Brasil, que, de uma certa maneira, né, infelizmente, né, estamos nessa onda também desse uma figura dita mito, né, e que acho que de mito está mais para minto mesmo, né? Mas eu queria falar, que você pudesse falar um pouco dessa questão do aspecto do herói, né? Que tanto fica, entre aspas, caracterizando, né, muitas posturas aí, né, americanas. Então, assim, eu gosto também do revista em quadrinho, né? E eu acompanhei alguma evolução de uns personagens, por exemplo, Batman, que em um tempo aí com Frank Miller, ele começa a se repensar, né? Acho que é isso que você falou, né? De trazer a questão, ele sair da inocência, né? Do herói que tá matando os maus, mas ele faz isso porque ele é, vamos dizer assim, neurótico, porque ele está caçando, entre aspas, aqueles que mataram os pais dele, né? Então, então, assim, você acha que isso tem repercussão ainda, ou são só alguns traços que vão repensar o herói, né? Ou se a maior parte continua com aquele herói mais tradicional, aquele vingador, exterminador, né? Neurótico.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's a great question. You follow these probably more than I do. I know Batman, of course, but the hero, it's a really, the heroic narrative. It's interesting because we know from Joseph Campbell, the hero goes through a journey. It's not always the American heroic story is always good against the bad and evil. It's very simplified. It is very simplified, us versus them. That's not the more mythological, philosophical view of the hero. What's problematic in the American heroism, and I'm talking now more government and collective, is something I mentioned earlier, the righteousness. The when there is violence, it's in the name of the good. It's in name of democracy or freedom. And there's a belief that there will be redemption in that. Civil war, that was a very interesting turning point where the United States was talking about how it is a symbol of democracy and freedom, yet there was this contradiction that within the borders of the country, there was slavery, which is the antidote to freedom and equality, to the message. So when civil war was fought, there was a belief that this slavery was a test almost that America had to go through. And now that it went through the test, now that slavery was abolished, it can really spread its ideas and ideals of freedom and democracy and equality in the rest of the world. But after Civil War, racism did not go away. It was, as we probably all know, I mean, there was Ku Klux Klan, there were the Jim Crow laws, and we still, in 2020, this past year, we witnessed so many brutal police killings in the United States of Black men and women. Out of nothing, really. The fear that Black Americans walk around with, just taking their cell phone out of their pocket, it can be seen as a gun and they can be shot in the moment. So not seeing all these contradictions within and always looking out to spread the message and do the heroic act of spreading democracy, freedom, redemption. You mentioned that in the comic books, the heroes look at themselves and rethink what they're doing, and that is not happening on the collective level. It's definitely happening on the margins. I mean, I'm having this conversation with you right now. I read a lot of cultural criticism. It's one of my favorite things is to read from philosophers, public intellectuals, and there's a lot of conversation happening on the sides, on the outskirts, but it's not in the mainstream culture. And there's that resistance that we were talking about, resistance to critical thinking, resistance to question the hero's journey, the motives, the redemption. And I think that comes from that place of, though the United States might see itself as this powerful place deep inside the fragility, the emptiness. We know with the narcissistic personality, there's such emptiness within. And it's very scary to look at that empty, fragile place. It needs to be done, but it doesn't always happen. I just hope that those of us who engage in these conversations are moving, and social change are not going to happen overnight. Like Gustavo's dear friends might think Biden is here. It's a whole new world. That's innocent. Yes, that's very innocent. Change is happening. I'm not entirely pessimistic, but I'm realistic, I think. It's very slow. It's very slow. But I do have some, I don't like the word hope so much, but I do have some hope in the movements that are rising, especially this past year in 2020. There has been a lot happening. But despite all that happened, that it got me excited about the, for instance, racial justice movement, Black Lives Matter movements, We Again, so that Trump got like almost half the votes, right? So that polarization, like I said, I'm in my echo chamber. I'm not watching Fox News. Probably I should watch Fox News more, but I cannot after a while. So.
Sim. Tá. Obrigada, tá?
Obrigado, Martinha. Beijo.
Beijo.
Elaine, contigo, por favor.
Olá, Ipek. Eu gostaria de agradecê-la imensamente pela tua exposição, que para mim foi muito rica e suscitou uma miríade de reflexões. Você, conforme você foi falando da relação de violência e inocência, me veio a imagem da banalização do mal, da qual Hannah Arendt fala tanto, né? E que é o que a gente está vivendo muito, né? E dessa simplificação da realidade, de como que ela é perigosa, né? Da fantasia tomada como fato, que também é uma questão perigosa. E aí me veio o livro de uma jornalista franco-alemã, que é da Geraldine Schwartz. Ela escreveu esse livro, Os Amnésicos. Tá? E essa jornalista, ela fala de uma coisa muito parecida com o que você está dizendo, é por isso que me chamou muita atenção a tua exposição, que na Alemanha nazista, muitas pessoas que não tinham essa atitude autorreflexiva foram na onda do coletivo e aderiram ao Partido Socialista e aderiram sem querer, né, a esse movimento nazista. E que, a partir daí, o mal ficou absolutamente... por falta dessa atitude reflexiva, né, e de uma fixação da imaginação, né, na atitude do arquétipo do herói, né, pegando um pouco o gancho do que a Marta acabou de dizer, e dos arquétipos citados pelo Marcos, agora há pouco, se não existe na cultura americana uma fixação do arquétipo do herói, essa é a minha primeira pergunta, e se não há numa relação entre Estados Unidos e Europa, uma relação, um ponto cego na observação de si mesmos, né? A Europa como um bloco, né? Fixada num padrão mais Senex, talvez, em alguns momentos, né? E se não existe uma fixação dos Estados Unidos nesse arquétipo do herói, do lado mais puer, como o Marcos estava falando, e às vezes até do arquétipo do herói, porque me veio uma imagem, né? Aqui na França, eu estou na França, né? Aqui na França, os americanos ainda têm os americanos são ainda considerados aqueles que vieram salvar a França, por exemplo, né, das garras do nazismo, né? O dia D representa um pouco isso, né? Foi aqui na Normandia, né? Então, assim, se não existe uma cola, né, desse arquétipo do herói na cultura americana consciente, né, tentando salvar a Europa, mas, ao mesmo tempo, eles identificados com esse padrão arquetípico heróico, se eles também não estabelecem a mesma dinâmica, uma política global tão nazista quanto o terrorismo que eles queriam salvar, né? Eu não sei se é uma pergunta em si, mas, enfim, você me fez revisitar, né, essas referências, né, essa relação entre novo mundo e velho mundo, puer, Senex, fixação no arquétipo do herói, essa questão também da economia sustentável, né? Se também não é uma outra atitude muito pautada na posição do arquétipo do herói em relação à natureza, né? Que considera a natureza como um objeto a ser explorado, né? E eu, herói antropocênico, né? Estou ali numa relação de dominação também. Se isso também não é uma atitude de fixação nesse arquétipo. Vai lá.
Lane, thank you so much for sharing your reflections. I'm actually delighted that my talk brought up all this in for you, and you had a lot of images and ideas there that came. I'm honored, really, that my talk could bring up all that for you. I'm going to try to respond to some of the threads. The fixation, I think that is so important. The fixation you're talking about, because, you know, in archetypes, if we are not aware of the archetype that we're living, we're really possessed by it, right? I mean, James Hillman, for instance, says we're always in the hold of an idea. And we just need to once we become aware of the idea or the archetype, then we can separate and look at that from a little distance and observe and witness ourselves in it. But if not, if we don't have that self-reflection, we're lost in it, we're possessed by it. In my book, for instance, I talked about Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus, when sailed to the New World, though, of course, he was thinking he was on the other side of the globe, he was possessed with these ideas of paradise when he got to the island, which is not, it was somewhere in the Bahamas. It's very contested where it really was, but somewhere in the Bahamas. When he got there, he thought, this is paradise on earth. And this is the paradise that Bible mentions, which means I'm the savior, I'm a prophet. And of course, I'm also going to find gold here and bring that gold to Spain. And that wealth, gold, will also open the doors to paradise for me in the other world. He couldn't find any gold, but he kept looking, and he had the native people enslaved looking for gold. And when they couldn't find gold, he didn't give up on it. He and his men were killing all these slaves, but he was so possessed with these ideas, the myths of the paradise and gold, he couldn't see outside of it. Even when he died, he was still believing that he was a prophet that had found the paradise on earth. It's very dangerous to be so fixated and not be able to see outside of that image. So whether it's hero or innocence, I think innocence is also one of them. When we're almost possessed by it, it's not the numinous archetype, it's really a possession. And then that's why, like, I really like James Baldwin saying innocence is the crime when you talk about the Nazis who did not question, just follow the collective. It was a crime. Their unquestioning was the crime. And it was, you know, obviously had very real life results of incredible amounts of death. I mean, it's these fantasies, we can't think of these fixations, archetypes, fantasies as being just internal, personal, private, isolated phenomena. They have very real world consequences. Christopher Columbus's fantasies ended up with such colonization, genocide that continued for centuries because it was almost embedded then. All the people who followed in his footsteps also were possessed with those ideas of paradise and gold and wealth. And still, I mean, that we in the United States, there is still that possession of monetary gold fantasy, right? So you just mentioned a lot of things. I'm trying to jump from one thing to another here, but amnesia, I believe the title of the book you shared was Amnesia, and amnesiacs and social amnesia is, I think, one of the most prominent collective defenses, psychological defenses in the United States. The social amnesia enables repressing those memories and maintains innocence. Because if the memories are there alive in the American psyche, innocence is impossible. It's impossible to claim innocence when you look at your history and see everything that's in there, genocide and slavery and all this imperialism, even the democracy itself, like the democratic experiment in the United States was founded upon slavery and imperial ambitions. I mean, those were always there from the beginning. If we see that, we can't be as idealistic. And now I'm saying we, and I'm thinking of Gustavo. But the United States could not be as, idealistic. It would, I think, what I would like to see is more humility, because there's so much hubris. There's so much hubris. And for me, the antidote is humility. And humility does not mean weakness. It doesn't mean weakness. It's more, in my understanding, it just goes hand in hand with honesty, integrity, and wisdom. And because there is a lot of strength in knowing oneself. So humility, being humble, is actually a strong possession. This might be very hard for a president like Trump, for instance, to see, because some of these leaders, and your leader included, they have a very different way of looking at strength. For me, in my understanding, strength that comes from wisdom is way more powerful than that stubborn, masculine, I make no mistake, I have no regrets. I find that to be a very problematic, false mask. I do also want to mention, you said Hannah Arendt, banalization of evil, which made me think, Elaine, of a quote by Hannah Arendt that I cherish, and this is what got me through the Trump administration. She says, even in the darkest times, we have a right to expect some illumination. And to me, it's not just a right to expect, but we have a responsibility as citizens. We have a responsibility to find that illumination. And I think that's our social responsibility. Our social responsibility as citizens don't end at the ballot box. It goes beyond casting my vote. That's why when Biden is president, I'm not done. I still have to continue doing this work, bringing in the push for critical thinking and questioning. And for everybody, this looks different, right? For some, they take to the streets and organize movements, protests. For another person, for an oral historian, it's about going to the marginalized communities and collecting their stories. For an artist, it might be making a big, beautiful mural that depicts those counter narratives. And for me, I call myself a cultural depth psychologist, for me, it's wrestling with these ideas, reading, thinking, writing about them, and then sharing my questions, not answers necessarily, my questions with others to spark new dialogues. Yeah, so your mention of Hannah Arendt made me go there, because that was a quote that even in the darkest times was on my desk. Every day I was looking at that and reminding myself of my responsibility to bring some sort of illumination to the dark times.
Muito obrigada, querida. Obrigada mesmo pelas tuas reflexões. E você me fez ainda avançar um pouco mais, mas eu vou deixar espaço para outras pessoas e depois, se houver oportunidade, eu entre em contato contigo. Obrigada.
Obrigado, Elaine. Lu.
Please do so. Please contact me. Thank you so much.
Ipek, muito obrigada pela sua exposição clara, consistente e instigante. Eu gostei muito do jeito que você trouxe a inocência, né? Porque eu sempre pensei a sociedade americana mais como compulsiva do que como inocente, pensando no par, Pan e ninfas, né? Então eu fiquei pensando nessa imagem da ninfa inocente e do Pan compulsivo, né? Na hora que, e eu acho que a sociedade americana tem esses dois aspectos, né? O que me parece que eu entendi aí da sua exposição é que falta a reflexão aí no meio desse caminho, né? Que a ninfa traria essa reflexão para o Pan, mas na sociedade americana isso não acontece, talvez pelo medo, né? Se eu bem entendi o que você colocou. Você trouxe exemplo de vários estupros, vamos dizer assim, né? Que a sociedade americana sofreu e mesmo assim volta no estado de ninfa. O que eu queria perguntar é como é que você está vendo agora o estupro da pandemia na sociedade americana? Como é que você vê como os americanos estão se relacionando com o PAN na pandemia?
That's an excellent question. Well, first of all, I love that you brought in Penn and the nymphs, because I think there's no single myth we talk about. When I talk about innocence, we can talk about Persephone, and we can talk about the nymphs and Penn. There's so many places that we can go to. United States or any nation or any person, we're not limited to one mythology, right? One story. I love that we can look at it from so many different perspectives, and from each story we get something new, a new insight. And rapes, right? It's physical, ecological, human rapes, and also the rape of the consciousness. I mean, every time there's this shock, it's a rape of the consciousness, but then you go back to being nymph. How strange and how problematic. The pen in the pandemic. It's interesting to see in the United States, the pandemic has been perceived very differently by different people. And it's very interesting how politicized the pandemic became. The right and the left have a very different reaction to it. When I talk to my parents, I tell them, walking down the street, you know who is a Republican, who is a Democratic candidate supporter, because the Democrats are wearing masks and Republicans are not wearing masks as much. And I am generalizing, really. I am kind of generalizing, but most of the time when we look at the states and their precautions, their requirements around COVID-19, that's been so. I mean, here in San Francisco, which is a very Democrat populated town, everybody's wearing masks and there's no indoor restaurants, this, that. Like, we have been there has been multiple lockdowns, and you go to Texas and there's no requirement for masks. What a big difference. So the reaction to the pen and the pandemic has been very different, how people met pen. Some met with pen with fear and caution, death anxiety almost, and some with that stubborn strength. Nothing is going to happen to me. No, not this is a hoax. There's no such thing as COVID. It's Bill Gates making it up. It's the Democrats making it up. And then all the numbers start rolling in, deaths and cases. Oh, that's fake news. You know, there's this, I think I make my stance pretty clear here that I'm very critical of that stance, and it cost a lot of lives. But it really shows how politically polarized, ideologically polarized the United States has become. When there is a pandemic that causes more than 500,000 dead, and there is two camps, two very different approaches, and for those who deny it, to still be in denial. And we have vaccinations, and actually today, I'll share this. This is our good news here that we're celebrating today. Today, there has been 100 million vaccinations. We got to that level, which is really something to celebrate. But there are so many people who are refusing the vaccine. The members of the Congress, United States Congress, 25% are not getting vaccinated. And they are leaders, you know, there are people who vote for these people and look up to them as their leaders, and those people will not get vaccinated. So I don't know, I don't think I gave you a straight answer about the pen and the pandemic, but I just want to underline how polarized the United States is right now. And the anxiety really comes from not being able to hold the tension of those opposites, the two sides. And because nobody is able to hold the tension of the opposites and have that, listen to that inner space, it's getting farther and farther apart. And what happens then? Breakdown, right? If so much anxiety and so much polarization causes breakdown. And that's a possibility. I'm not writing that off. I'm not meaning like Trump was saying civil war. If I'm not the next president again, there will be civil war. I don't think it's a matter of civil war, but yeah, the dark times has not ended. It's still very, very much complex.
Muito parecida. A resposta que você estava dando, você podia dar para a nossa situação aqui no Brasil. Essa polarização. A diferença maior é que a gente está com um número de vacinas muito menor do que essa. Mas muito obrigada, muito obrigada.
Obrigado, Lu. Lice Mary tem uma pergunta. Você escreveu. Quer fazer, Lice Mary?
Boa tarde a todos. Agradeço, né, pontos de reflexão. Eu acho que a pergunta que eu tenho até traz um pouquinho justamente o tema da pandemia, né? Nos últimos, hoje assistindo o jornal, estava falando que nos últimos 2 dias está tendo um número de agressões maiores aos asiáticos que moram aí nos Estados Unidos, né? E aí eu queria saber se isso poderia ser considerado também um vício da inocência, né? Já que achando que é agredindo aqueles de onde originou-se o vírus. Eu queria saber um pouquinho sobre isso, se ela puder falar.
Yes, it is a very, very valid concern. Just Monday, there was a mass shooting. A young man killed 8 people into massage spas, and 6 of those women were Asian Americans. And of course, the narrative, first of all, one of the officers, a sheriff, I believe, in Atlanta, who was reporting on this, said in the press release, oh, the man was just having a really bad day. To say when a white man goes on a rampage and kills 8 people, 6 Asian American women, and the other 2 were just a delivery person and just a standby person. The fact that this can be written off as he was having a bad day, think about it, if it was a Muslim that killed 8 Americans, the narrative would be very different. It would be religious extremism and terrorism. So it's there's always this protection of the white male, first of all. But it's true, there has been a lot of hate crimes. There has been a lot of expression from the Asian American community about their fears, about the harassments that they've been experiencing, and it has not been taken seriously until now, at least. Of course, with the president, Donald Trump being the previous president, he used to call COVID-19 the Chinese virus. He called it Kung Flu, like openly in his press releases. So he was very consciously too inflaming this rhetoric. He was very consciously othering, because when you project it and say, this is the Chinese virus, then it relieves him of responsibility. The evil Chinese virus, we good Americans. It's really problematic. So this has been brewing up quite a bit in the past year, and this week's the Monday shooting really brought it up to the attention of all. And today, I believe Biden is giving a speech there. They lowered the American flag. He gave a speech, and of course, these are symbolic acts, lowering the flag and talking about it. It's symbolic. However, I don't want to dismiss the symbolic either. And it's an acknowledgement. What happened on Monday is, I worry that it's not going to be the last. It's not going to be the last. This has already been happening. Beatings, verbal harassment. They have been happening, and they've been underreported. Perhaps now they will be more reported, but it's a very valid concern. And I don't know if the United States, if it is special to United States, I don't know if attacks like this are happening in other parts. But like I said, for the past year, we had a president that was very much endorsing and inflaming this kind of violent rhetoric. And yeah, he was very, very good at that. He was always emboldened by violence, very openly so. And that violent rhetoric, of course, then becomes real world violence. It's a very, very concerning, sad time in that sense. And yeah, we're braced for worse almost. I am. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ipek, fazer duas perguntas para a gente começar a finalizar o nosso encontro, tá? Você acha que a contracultura, o movimento de contracultura nos Estados Unidos na década de 60, é uma outra forma de inocência? Bom, essa é a primeira pergunta, depois eu faço a outra. Mas a gente poderia pensar isso. A contracultura foi um movimento também, entre aspas, inocente?
Marcus, thank you so much. So the counterculture movement, I don't know, I have not studied so deeply about it. So it's going to be somewhat of a limited response. So much happened in the 60s, of course. And there was movement forward. But did that make a whole new world in the United States? It didn't. You know, I mean, I'm just gonna, this is not necessarily counterculture movement, the flower child, right? But for instance, civil rights was such an important movement in American history. But then once the Civil Rights Act passed, to think, well, now everyone's equal, that is very innocent to think. Civil Rights Act, voting rights did not make everyone equal. And when Barack Obama was elected as president, people said, see, there's no racism in the United States. Well, that's very innocent. Of course, there's racism everywhere. It's just that's saying, now we have a Black president, there's no racism. That innocence, that color blindness is trying not to take responsibility, not see what all the underlying issues and still existing, festering, suffering. The counterculture movement, there's innocence, I guess, in every movement, right? There's has to be some sort of optimism. When I say innocence here, I don't mean the not wanting to know, not knowing, but that optimism, this faith and belief in other possibilities, new beginnings. We need that for movements. We need that as human. I think it's problematic if it's such an innocence that it clouds everything else. It's blinding. If it's this bright, shining innocence, then it's blinding and you don't then see all the complexities, all the other things, perspectives happening around, and you're just so zeroed in on the optimism. That one-sidedness, black and white thinking. But for countercultural movements to be perhaps less innocent, there has to be more intersectionality, in my opinion. So women's rights, racial rights, you know, human rights in general, but also economic movements. Everything is so interrelated. And if we silo them, it's not enough. So the counterculture movement in some ways, as like I said, I don't know too deeply about it, but it wasn't all, as far as I understand, inclusive as much. It's, yeah.
Tá. Deixa eu te fazer a última questão. Queria ouvir a tua opinião, comentário teu. Ao longo do século XX, o Brasil ocupou um lugar no imaginário ocidental de um país, até devido às suas origens, um país multirracial, um país aberto à tolerância, um país miscigenado, um país de convívio harmonioso entre diferentes religiões, um país sexualmente livre, um país de imenso convívio e apreço pela própria ideia de natureza. E nós, Ipek, essas são as fantasias brasileiras, e nós acreditamos nela. Nós acreditamos nela. Nos últimos 4 anos, nós descobrimos que nós somos um país que comete o maior número de crimes homofóbicos, somos um país que se mata por crimes de intolerância religiosa, somos um país racista, o último país do mundo a abolir a escravidão, e somos um país de imensos desastres ecológicos. A minha pergunta é, será que a inocência, cada país tem um certo padrão de inocência próprio? Será que nós, brasileiros, também nos tornamos inocentes ao acreditarmos nessa fantasia de um Eldorado brasileiro ou de um país extremamente tolerante? Ou seja, será a inocência um traço arquetípico presente em cada país ou em cada cultura?
I do believe so. And I won't say, I think the American brand of innocence might look different than, for instance, Brazilian brand of innocence, but there is an archetypal core. And we, each human have that too. We have our persona, how we think we are, how we think we present ourselves to the world. But then there's a shadow, right? And from what you are saying, Marcus, I'm hearing almost that. You know, there's this beautiful fantasy, the self-identification with all these positive values. And some of it is true. However, there's also the shadow, in the shadow, the other parts. And I earlier said, I don't think those that are pushed away go away. They are very present. And the fact that currently Brazil has a leader that is so openly, you know, homophobic. Right now, there's all this violent rhetoric and environmental destruction that means that the shadow is really, like, as I was saying, Trump eliminated traits of the American shadow. Right now, Brazil is facing its shadow in the mirror. What's complicated to me is when Health the Nation is very attracted to this shadow. Right? I almost feel like in the US, when I was thinking about it, it's like shadow attraction. It's all that was pushed coming out and, you know, sitting in the White House. Some people are rejoiced. They almost feel perhaps more free. You know, their racism and their sexism is suddenly more acceptable if the president is embodying it. Perhaps I'm just, you know, I'm wondering out loud here. But there's a shadow attraction, and right now it is coming up in Brazil too, and you're face to face with it. And I guess the question is, what will Brazil do with it? I mean, we saw what the US did. We elected a different president, but in the meantime, the shadow didn't go away. There's still a lot of work to be done, and there is still half the country who is in favor of what I call the shadow figure. So but about the innocence, I do, based on my work in this area, based on my research, I do think innocence is really such a central thing in the US psyche. Like, it is a very central wound. I don't know if it's so in Brazil, and Hillman would say we're always in the hold of an idea. It's a question for me to ask you, for you to ponder, what is that idea for Brazil that has a hold on the Brazilian psyche? Perhaps it's something else. Innocence will be there, but there will be something else too. I do not know that.
Eu também não sei, mas eu acho que você forneceu algumas pistas para a gente poder pensar isso adiante, né? Não sei se exatamente a palavra seria inocência, mas tem alguma coisa também na psique brasileira que guarda um tom de não somos exatamente aquele que nos vemos refletidos no espelho. Tem um descompasso aí. Mas esse é o nosso dever de casa a partir do que a gente pôde te ouvir hoje.
Yeah, and I think that's very natural, Marcus. I mean, it's true for Brazil, it's true for United States, it's true for each individual. None of us are necessarily that's why we take the psychology journey to, it's a brave journey. Not everybody wants to go there, but to unpack and to better understand our wholeness, as imperfect as it is.
Ipek, muito obrigado pela tua presença. A tua palestra de hoje, ela foi muito singular, porque, pelo menos a minha experiência, eu te ouvi de um lado, você narrando, né, o seu diagnóstico sobre a história americana, sobre a psique americana, mas para mim foi muito difícil não pensar na nossa realidade brasileira. Em algum lugar, hoje, nesse exato momento, março de 2021, está tudo muito perto, muito próximo. Então, eu acho que você trouxe ferramentas muito interessantes para a gente poder pensar e entender melhor esse fenômeno complexo que é a realidade americana, mas também para que a gente possa entender esse pesadelo que a gente está vivendo no Brasil. Queria te agradecer muito pela presença, pelas tuas ideias sofisticadas, densas, complexas. Abriu um horizonte imenso para a gente. Muito obrigado pela tua presença. Espero que você tenha gostado também.
Very much enjoyed it, and in the future, hopefully in a healthy world, like I said, I hope that we can do this in person. I would love to come to Brazil. I've never been there. I would love to do that.
Em algum momento no futuro, a gente vai fazer um encontro do Tiaços pessoalmente. Brasil, Estados Unidos, Europa, a gente vai circular pelo mundo e a gente vai se encontrar por aí. Você já foi vacinada, Ipek?
I got my first dose on Wednesday, and my second dose will be in middle of April.
Ótimo. Cuide-se
Thank
bem,
you.
cuide-se dos seus. Obrigado pela tua presença, tá?
Thank you. Thank you. It's been such an honor and pleasure. And thank you for the amazing questions. You gave me a lot to think about and wrestle with as well. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening over there.
Que ótimo. Quem quiser ter notícias mais da Ipek, eu pus o site dela no nosso grupo. Depois, quem quiser fazer perguntas, eu também posso passar o e-mail da Ipek para que as perguntas sejam enviadas, tá bom? Pessoal, agradeço mais um encontro do Tiaços. Acho que esse foi bem particular, bem atual. Estou levemente incomodado aqui, mas vamos adiante. Vamos fazer vida e resistir, tá bom? Isa, obrigado pela tua gentileza. Luximenes, obrigado pela parceria de sempre. Vamos adiante. Sexta-feira tem mais Tiaços, tá bom? Um abraço em todos. Bom fim de semana. Tchau, Ipek.
Thank you.